The year is 1941, and the map of Europe is bleeding. To the north, the German Wehrmacht is clawing toward the spires of Moscow. To the south, the breadbasket of Ukraine has been trampled under the tread of the panzer. But there is a jagged splinter in the side of the German advance, a fortress city that defies the logic of the Blitzkrieg. It is a place where the land meets the deep blue of the Black Sea, a city carved into limestone and reinforced with the pride of an empire. This is Sevastopol. For the High Command in Berlin, Sevastopol was not merely a strategic objective. It was a psychological necessity. As long as the Soviet Black Sea Fleet held this bastion, the southern flank of the German army remained vulnerable, and the oil fields of the Caucasus remained a distant, shimmering mirage. But for the men on the ground, Sevastopol would become something else entirely. It would become a furnace that consumed divisions, a laboratory for the most horrific artillery ever conceived by man, and a testament to the terrifying endurance of the human spirit under the weight of total annihilation. The prelude to this catastrophe began in the autumn of 1941, when Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most gifted tactical mind in the German officer corps, was given command of the 11th Army. His mission was simple on paper but a nightmare in geography: seize the Crimean Peninsula. To do so, his forces had to squeeze through the Perekop Isthmus, a narrow bottleneck of land barely 5 miles wide. It was a kill zone. The Soviet defenders had spent months digging into the salt marshes and steppe, creating a layer of defenses that forced the Germans to pay for every meter in blood. Yet, systemic failures within the Soviet High Command began to manifest early. Despite the bravery of the rank-and-file soldier, the initial defense of the Crimea was hampered by a rigid, centralized bureaucracy that struggled to adapt to the speed of Manstein's maneuvers. The Soviet commanders in the region were caught between the desire to hold every inch of ground and the reality of German air superiority. When the German 11th Army finally burst through the isthmus in late October, the retreat was chaotic. The road to the heart of the peninsula lay open, or so it seemed. But as the Germans raced toward the southern coast, they encountered a structural reality they had underestimated. Sevastopol was not just a city, it was an integrated weapons system. Built over decades, its defenses were anchored by massive coastal batteries that housed some of the largest naval guns in the world. Batteries 30 and 35, known to the Germans as Maxim Gorky 1 and 2, were subterranean fortresses of reinforced concrete, topped with armored turrets that could hurl 2-ton shells miles into the hinterland. The first tactical disaster for the Germans occurred in November 1941. Manstein, hoping to seize the city on the move before the defenders could consolidate, launched a hurried assault. He believed the Soviet morale was shattered. He was wrong. The sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, many of whom had been formed into naval infantry brigades, fought with a ferocity that stunned the Wehrmacht. These men, clad in their distinctive black pea coats, earned the nickname Black Death from the German infantry. They did not retreat. They died where they stood, often in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the ravines surrounding the city. By December, the siege had settled into a grim rhythm. The German forces were stretched thin, their supply lines shivering under the first bites of a brutal winter. Then came the Soviet counterstroke. In a daring amphibious operation, the Red Army landed thousands of troops at Kerch and Feodosia, on the eastern tip of the Crimea. This move nearly unraveled Manstein's entire campaign. He was forced to divert precious divisions away from the gates of Sevastopol to deal with this new threat, buying the city's defenders a reprieve of nearly 6 months. During this lull, the city of Sevastopol transformed into a subterranean society. With the surface under constant aerial bombardment, the life of the city moved into the caves. Factories, hospitals, and even schools were established in the vast limestone caverns. Women and children worked alongside soldiers, assembling grenades and repairing small arms while the earth shook above them. This was the silent heroism of the civilian population, a structural defiance that the German intelligence services had failed to account for in their calculations of victory. However, the systemic failure of the Soviet position was the sea. While the Black Sea Fleet could run the blockade to bring in supplies and reinforcements, the Luftwaffe gradually tightened its grip. The port of Sevastopol became a graveyard of sunken ships. Every ton of grain and every crate of ammunition brought into the city was paid for with the lives of sailors. By the spring of 1942, the German blockade was so effective that the defenders were beginning to run low on the one thing they needed most: artillery shells. Manstein, meanwhile, was preparing for Operation Storfang, the final assault. He knew that conventional tactics would not breach the Maxim Gorky batteries. He needed something more. He turned to the industrial giants of the Ruhr, calling for the heaviest siege engines ever built. This was the era of the monsters. The Germans deployed the Karl-Gerät, massive 600mm self-propelled mortars, and the crown jewel of Nazi hubris, the Schwer Gustav. The Gustav was a railway gun of such immense proportions that it required a double track to move and a crew of thousands to operate and protect. Its barrel was 30 meters long, and it fired shells the size of a luxury sedan. When the Gustav opened fire on the white cliffs of Sevastopol, the very foundations of the earth seemed to groan. One shell penetrated 30 meters of natural rock and concrete to detonate an underground ammunition magazine at Sevastopol Bay, sending a mushroom cloud into the sky that could be seen for 50 miles. But the tactical reality on the ground remained a meat grinder. The German infantry had to clear the outer rings of the defense, which consisted of hundreds of small bunkers, snipers and appos, nests, and minefields. The terrain was a labyrinth of jagged cliffs and deep gullies, each one a natural fortress. The German soldiers found themselves in a war of attrition that felt more like the Somme in 1916 than the Lightning War of 1941. The casualty rates among the German assault pioneers were catastrophic, with some units losing 70% of their strength in a single afternoon. The unsung heroes of this period were the Soviet engineers and telephone operators who worked in the darkness of the bunkers. Under the heaviest bombardment in history, they kept the lines of communication open, allowing the Soviet commanders to coordinate fire from the great batteries. Even when the turrets of Battery 30 were hit by direct fire from the Karl-Gerät mortars, the crews inside continued to load and fire by hand, long after the mechanical hoists had been crushed into scrap metal. As June 1942 progressed, the German pressure became unbearable. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, flew thousands of sorties, turning the city of Sevastopol into a landscape of white dust and charred ruins. There was no longer any cover. The Soviet defenders were pushed back to the very edge of the cliffs, their backs to the sea. The systemic failure now lay in the hands of the high command in Moscow. Stalin, obsessed with the defense of the city, had waited too long to authorize an evacuation. The final act of the tragedy began to unfold at the end of June. The German forces finally managed to cross the Sevastopol Bay in a daring nighttime amphibious assault, catching the defenders by surprise. This bypassed the strongest remaining fortifications and signaled the end. The command structure of the Sevastopol defense area began to collapse. High-ranking officers were evacuated by submarine, leaving tens of thousands of rank-and-file soldiers and wounded men behind to face the vengeance of the 11th Army. The scene at the Chersonesus Peninsula in the final days of the siege was one of biblical horror. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, having run out of ammunition, stood on the rocky shores, staring out at a sea that offered no escape. They had fought for 250 days, enduring a weight of explosives that exceeded anything seen on the Eastern Front, only to be abandoned by their own leadership. The German infantry, exhausted and embittered by their own losses, closed in for the kill. Yet, even in these final hours, there were pockets of resistance that defied belief. Small groups of sailors and soldiers retreated into the coastal caves, refusing to surrender. They fought on for weeks in the darkness, launching nighttime raids against the German patrols. The Germans were eventually forced to use flamethrowers and poison gas to clear these tunnels, a grim precursor to the ideological war of extermination that would soon consume the rest of the Soviet Union. Continue.